SAGA Shorts.
Hey subscribers, this is part one of a two-part SAGA short that I'm going to be presenting on multiphase flow and RTA. This is a subject that has an enormous amount of attention over the past few years, obviously with unconventional development and liquids-rich plays and all that sort of thing. Last time I checked One Petro, there was no less than 250 papers specifically on the subject of multiphase flow and RTA, production analysis, or reservoir modeling. So how do we navigate through all the noise? There's a lot of stuff out there. What I'm going to try and do with this presentation is sort of simplify things, distill it down to what I think are the most important components. And we'll go through a specific example with a specialized plot, show how we can use the single phase approximation, where that works and where it sort of falls short. And I'll talk a little bit about the rigorous pseudo pressure implementation that is something that can be applied as well. So there's rather a lot going on this slide, but let's go through what I'd like to talk about. This is one way to sort of visualize in a snapshot in time what's going on in the reservoir. So over here on the left, we have sort of an element of the reservoir, a small element of the reservoir, and we can think of this as the elemental expression of Darcys Law. So we have a flow rate going through, and we have the flow rate being related to the pressure gradient over that distance. And then, of course, you've got your permeability, formation volume factor, viscosity, all of those things. And if we start with just oil above the bubble point, this, of course, is what all of the pressure transient equations and so on are based on. This is sort of the linear relationship between rate and pressure. And everything we do is sort of based on this assumption. The properties I'm tracking down here at the bottom are permeability, formation volume factor, and viscosity. And we can see in the single phase case, they don't stay exactly, like formation volume factor changes a tiny little bit, viscosity changes a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, we assume these things are flat. And that's why that linear relationship holds. When we get into looking at something like still single phase, but looking at gas, the situation gets a little bit more complicated because now we have a fluid where properties such as formation volume factor and viscosity change significantly with pressure. So we now have a nonlinear relationship between flow rate and pressure drop. So the subject of this discussion, though, is the third case, and this would be our oil below the bubble point. And in this case, the picture gets even more complicated by the fact that we have permeability changing. And that permeability would be the relative permeability of oil. So as gas comes out of solution, we've got, our permeability of oil is going to start dropping. We have a fairly complex thing going on with formation volume factor. As we reach bubble point conditions, it starts to decrease. And then we have viscosity obviously changing as well. So fairly complex sort of relationship now between flow rate and pressure drop. And so what I'd like to do is, this is a very sort of theoretical present way of talking about it, but I want to show you in a much more practical way how this impacts your RTA interpretation. So let's take a look at how, in the previous plot, we're just looking at one snapshot in time. So what I'm going to do now is sort of go frame by frame through time as we fall through the bubble point. So each one of these represents a point in time. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And this picture over here is showing how the pressure changes over, inside the reservoir over some length from, out in the reservoir towards the sand face. And the bubble point is shown here. And so we can see, as time goes on, we're sort of moving down in this direction. And what happens is as we drop below the bubble point, you get this nonlinearity, similar to what you saw in the previous slide. The pressure is actually lower than the linear extrapolation would suggest that it would be. So if we take this and sort of map it onto a specialized plot, which of course is the normalized flow rate, normalized flow rate plotted against the square root of material balance time, what happens in points 3 and 4 is they become detached from that straight line behavior. And those of you who do RTA on a regular basis will realize that that could potentially cause a huge problem because we're going to misinterpret that as boundaries, when in reality, it's just purely a multi-phase flow effect. So this is really the issue that we have with multi-phase flow, is going to cause this sort of deviation on that specialized flow plot or specialized plot, and make it difficult for us to really understand what's happening here. So let's take a theoretical case, and I generated this data using a simulator. And what I wanted to show was sort of the ideal case. We're assuming constant pressure but low drawdown, so our flowing pressure remains above bubble point. And so this should be, the textbook case of everything works properly because there's really no multi-phase flow effects here at all. We're not dropping below the bubble point. And so in this example, our TETF, or time to end of transient flow, can easily be sort of mapped out by that vertical straight line. And we can get our A root K from the slope of this line. So that's kind of, everything sort of works out well there. The question is now, what happens if I take that same model, but allow the pressure to drop below bubble point? And there's different ways you can do that. One way is to, instead of having a low drawdown, just simply lower the flowing pressure. So now the flowing pressure is below bubble point through the whole history. That's this one here. By the way, the green curve is sort of our template, our single phase case. And then we have another case where we have variable rate pressure. So in both of these cases, they're just different operating conditions. But in both of those cases, the flowing pressure drops below bubble point. And so we just want to sort of compare, what does the specialized plot look like here? And one thing that's encouraging is if you were using this to get A root K, even though in 2 of the 3 cases here we've dropped below bubble point, we're still going to get a pretty good A root K. It doesn't really affect the slope of this line. Where we're going to run into problems is it's going to skew our interpretation of TETF. And I'll talk more about that as we go through, but that's sort of going to be the main problem with multi-phase flow in trying to do a single phase analysis. What you really want to do with this sort of interpretation is take a close look at the GeOR, gas oil ratio. And so here's the 3 cases, and then just looking at GeOR and how it changes with time. In our low drawdown case with constant pressure, of course, the GeOR remains flat. So that's an easy one. With the high drawdown case, we have GeOR that sort of increases, but whatever you want to call that, it doesn't change severely. It's not too bad. And then the variable rate pressure one, GeOR probably changes the most severe. That would be this one here. So the way to think about this is if you're trying to analyze data through a period where GeOR is changing significantly, that's probably where you're going to see the most problems with the interpretation. So let's do an analysis now of the using this variable rate pressure. In this case, we know we have a significant change in GeOR going on during that early time period. So how bad is it going to mess up our analysis? And this really shows us because we're using known data, simulated data. So we know what the answer is. We know that this is our time to end of transient flow right here, that green line. And so if we were doing this interpretation, we would have probably underestimated that TETF and probably would have picked it somewhere around here. So that's where we're, that sort of helps you visualize how far we're going to be off in using that single phase flow approximation. The other thing that impacts the single phase flow approximation significantly is your permeability. In a very low perm scenario, such as 100 nanodarcies, for example, the problem is going to be significantly worse. And the reason being is very simple, right? You've got a longer transient flow period, and you've got more opportunity for the GeOR to change significantly within that transient flow period when you've got low permeability. If you have higher permeability and you see those boundaries faster, it's going to probably be easier to pick that time to end of transient flow without having all the obfuscation of GeOR changing significantly. So all other things being equal, higher perm is going to make it easier to do this interpretation and get a reasonable answer. Okay, so now that I've given you sort of the landscape of just doing the simple approximation, you might say, if there's all these papers out there, why don't we do something a little bit more rigorous? And it turns out there is a rigorous implementation, what we call pseudo pressure for oil. In the full RTA course that I have on the SAGA platform, I go into a lot more detail on this. We'll just sort of present it really quickly here. I showed you before how the relationship between rate and pressure drop in a core, for example, using this sort of Darcys Law relationship, becomes nonlinear when we drop below the bubble point. And pseudo pressure is really the expression of that nonlinear pressure. So rather than using pressure, we use pseudo pressure. Pseudo pressure incorporates all of these things like changing relative permeability, changing formation volume factor, viscosity. And there's a lot more detail to that. I won't get into it here, but we can use this. So instead of plotting pressure, if we plot pseudo pressure, it should make it, should correct for these problems. And this is what the correction would look like. So the dotted lines that you see in this picture represent, that linear behavior that you would want to see in an equivalent single phase case. And if you plot the pseudo pressure, that's indeed where it corrects it to. So rather than having this line detaching from the straight line behavior, those points are going to be, in theory anyways, aligned back down onto the straight line. The problem with this is when you actually try it and do it in practice, it doesn't work quite as well as you would hope. And there's still a lot of research being done on this. And I think that's why there's so much literature out there. Nobody's really figured out how to put this into practice and make it work, in a very repeatable and robust sort of way. So there is some more work to be done here. What I would say, in general is it's probably just as good to use the single phase assumption in a specialized plot than it is to use a multi-phase correction. And this picture sort of gives you the indication here. Neither of them are perfect. Neither of them have collapsed down onto that straight line the way that they're supposed to. Neither of them, I think you would agree, would give you an accurate determination of time to end of transient flow, which in theory is happening right around here. So take that for what it's worth. My recommended workflow is to really just stick with the single phase approximation. But in general, multi-phase flow can definitely obscure your analysis, especially if GeOR varies significantly within the period of early transient linear flow. What we want to watch out for are things like high drawdown and low permeability. As I mentioned before, the recommended workflow is to use that simple single phase approach. The pseudo pressure implementation is something you can always run, and if you have access to it. It's not necessarily going to help the interpretation be better. That's been my experience, but it's there as well. So this stuff is just the tip of the iceberg. On the Saga Wisdom platform, there's 5 full days of detailed RTA course material. If you're interested in getting your company set up with some of this material, please contact us at info@sagawisdom.com.